In this tutorial, I'm going to take a scene made with the Cinema 4D render engine and talk about some tips to converting it over to using Thea Render. Within this process, I'm going to talk about the Cinema 4D render engine a little bit, saying how to get physically accurate renders within Cinema 4D, and then showing how that converts over to Thea Render. To do that, I've made this simple scene. Within this simple scene, there is this light. To make the light physically accurate, it has an area to it, because in real life, lights do have an area that they are emitting light out of. The best example of this would be the monitor you're currently looking at, which emits light over an area. Even let's take the sun, for example. It emits light over a very large area. There is also I've also turned on show and render and show and reflection, because the light will always be seen within reflections in real life, and have inverse square physically accurate, because in real life the light will decrease with the square of the distance. Z direction has been turned on. This is just to have it emit light out of the front part of the plane instead of the front and back part of the plane. This has got nothing to do with physically accurate. Other thing is I'll be using the physical render engine. It does render more physically accurate in some cases. In this case it doesn't really make a difference, but I'm still using it because it renders quicker. On the material, I have a reflection with a Fresnel on it. I've also heard it called Fresnel. Not really sure which one is accurate. I have turned on the physical index of refraction to be used, because this is a more accurate gradient to be used with Fresnel than the default gradient. And I have turned on additive, because this gets rid of that unrealistic dark ring on the outer part. Blurriness is turned on because in real life a material with a blurry reflection will give the same effect as what is called specular within Cinema 4D. And I'll show this by doing some renders. I've actually done a couple of renders already. This first one is with the blurry reflection. The second one is with the reflection turned off on the material and specular turned on. As can be seen, the reflection of the light looks pretty much the same. There is some difference here because the sphere is reflecting the ground and the ground here is reflecting the sphere. This gives the render a little bit more realism to it, because it does have this, and this is what would happen in real life. I've then done a render with Thea Render, and this looks different than the Cinema 4D render because it calculates light bounces. To get Cinema 4D to render more physically accurate, global illumination does need to be turned on, which I did for this last render. I turned on reflection again with global illumination to get the most physically accurate render in Cinema 4D possible. Comparing this to the Thea render, they do look pretty close to exactly the same. So the importance with this is that in Thea Render there is no specular setting. Instead, to get that same effect, we have to go down and give it some roughness and make sure there is reflectance. Then adjust the index of refraction and K value to the right settings to give the correct effect that we're looking for. There are other things we can do to adjust the reflection, like anisotropy, which Cinema 4D does not have a real anisotropy within it. Instead, it tries to fake it with something called lumis, which is an effect that's supposed to be put on the luminance channel. Theoretically, with the correct normal map, we could get a real anisotropy going within Cinema 4D, but that's a whole nother story. Within the render, here the last thing I want to point out is that there are these jagged edges in Thea Render, on the Thea Render render, because the current plugin that I'm using, which is this one, does not take into account render perfect. Instead, to get the rear looking more smooth, we should up the segments, and then with Thea Render, when rendering, it should appear to be smooth. And as we can see, it does appear a lot more smooth than it did before. Next thing I'm going to show is how to do depth of field using the Thea to Cinema 4D plugin. In this scene, I have a camera set up with a Thea camera tag, which is the proper way to get depth of field working. Now let's turn on interactive render region, and as we can see, the depth of field is working. It's actually working correctly through glass and within reflections. So to get this working, we need the Thea camera tag, and we need to uncheck pinhole and check depth of field. If we have depth of field unchecked and pinhole checked, then there is no depth of field whatsoever. So uncheck pinhole, check depth of field, and now the smaller the value right here, the greater the depth of field is going to be. And if we make it less depth of field. I'll leave that at 10%. To adjust the focal point of the depth of field, click on the camera, go to Object, and the focal distance is what's going to adjust the depth of field here. We can click on the arrow to select an object in the scene and have it focus on that, or adjust the value right here. The next scene I'm going to show is available in the content browser of Cinema 4D under Presets, Studio, Render. I'm going to use the GI scene here. If we do not have the studio version of Cinema 4D, we can get this scene by downloading the demo of Cinema 4D. I'll open that up. So now let's do a render, so we have something to compare the Thea Render render we're about to do to. Now convert this over to Thea Render. I like going Edit, Select All, switching this to Unbiased, because it will give a quicker preview that is more accurate to what it will look like in Thea Render when using an unbiased engine, which is my preference. I like using the unbiased engines. Now let's switch this over to Thea Render, and I can open up the darkroom by going to Plugins, Thea Render, darkroom, this is going to help out because we do not have a camera with a Thea Render camera tag on it. So this way we can adjust the brightness right here. We can also change the way it is interactive, the engine core right here, to Presto MC. The other way to have interactive render use Presto MC would be to switch this to Presto MC, and that would also switch it in the darkroom's interactive render to Presto MC. I switch this to lower GPU because I want the CPU to be doing the screen capture. I'm not going to use it for rendering with the GPU. Now open the darkroom again, interactive render. It's looking pretty good except for the brightness, which I can adjust after it's rendered or during the rendering. So that's looking pretty good. We can keep it rendering to get rid of the rest of the grain that's here. But for me, this is good enough because I like to use a denoiser to get rid of this little bit of grain that's left over. That means with Thea Render, I can do a shorter render and save on rendering time by using a denoiser in post. I'm not going to close this. Instead, let's store that to transfer it over to the picture viewer. We can compare this to the Cinema 4D render. Cinema 4D looks a little bit darker, so we can now go back to the darkroom, make it a little darker, press store again. We didn't have to re-render it, and now it looks closer to the Cinema 4D render. The difference here is that the Thea Render does have shadows that look more accurate. We can get shadows that look like this within Cinema 4D, but it will take much higher global illumination settings. In the Cinema 4D render, we also see there does appear to be some GI spots, so the global illumination settings definitely were not high enough. This next scene I'm going to open up. I'm not going to complete fully because it would actually take a while to convert over all the materials, but I'll be able to show a couple of good tips with it. So this one's going to be the weathering shader scene. Within this scene, there are quite a lot of materials used and a lot of maps. So since we open this from the content browser, we do need to save it out with assets, because otherwise Thea Render cannot use the file format, the I think it's L4D or something like that, that is used for the content browser. It needs the actual texture files. So to quickly get all the texture files saved out from the content browser file, let's do File, Save Project with Assets. I've actually already done this right here. So it can be seen here are all the textures saved out, plus a couple. Right now, with this version of Thea for Cinema 4D, when it bakes out the texture, it does not bake it out with the ambient occlusion. It will bake it out instead like this. So to get that ambient occlusion, we can bake out the texture within Cinema 4D, and it will bake it out then with ambient occlusion. I do see why it wasn't included, is because baking out the ambient occlusion in Cinema 4D can take quite a while, and also Thea Render has its own ambient occlusion that we can enable within the biased render engine. So most of the time it's not needed, but in this very specialized case it's using a specific weather shader to get this effect around where the pipes are. But now we have the texture saved out here for Thea Render to use. We can now go to Plugins, Thea Render, Convert Materials. But before we do that in this case, we should probably select them all, copy them. This way we can convert the materials over and paste them back into the scene after Thea Render converts them. So I'll convert them. Now I want to go to Edit, select all, General, and switch this to Unbiased, because it will render a lot quicker on the preview and give a better representation of what it's going to look like when it's finally rendered. Now I can go to Layers, create two different layers, one for the Thea mats and one for the Cinema 4D mats, and put them on the appropriate layer. Now paste in the old Cinema 4D materials and put them on the other layer, the Cinema 4D layer. Now we have both the Thea materials and the old Cinema 4D materials to compare to. This helps out a lot because even with the best material conversion, sometimes Cinema 4D materials have to be made a little bit in a strange way to give the right look, and there's no way that can be converted over correctly all the time. So this way we can have what the Cinema 4D material look like and more easily compare it to the Thea Render material to get them looking pretty much the same. Right off the bat we can see that none of these materials should be emitting light. In Thea Render, some of them are emitting light, they have emittance to them, because within the Cinema 4D material they have luminance turned on to get the right look and fake light going through the leaf. So let's fix that. Select them all, turn off emittance for all of them. We also see that this leaf has not had the texture carried over, and that's because this leaf is using this layer procedural shader. In the future maybe it will be added, but it kind of does make sense not to carry it over, because we should double check on it and see if we really do need to have this procedural shader carried over to Thea Render. In this case we don't, because Thea Render does have its own filters where we can get this same effect within Thea Render, and that way it will not have to convert over and bake out the procedural texture and then render it in Thea Render. It can do all the different effects within Thea Render, and that makes it quicker. So let's copy this channel over, paste this into Thea Render. Now we got the leaf texture. I'm also going to paste it into translucent. To get that look of light going through the leaf. For leaves and other organic objects, I like putting index of refraction at 1.33, same as water. Make sure Fresnel is on. Probably doesn't need this much roughness, maybe 15. And last, this actually does have a normal map to it from a normalizer. The normalizer takes a black and white image and turns it into a normal map. In Thea Render, we do not need this because the bump map is actually pretty good. So I'm going to copy this, paste it into Thea Render, and we can see how much more bumpy it gets. To show this better, I'm going to switch it to the cloth preview. Now we can see bump 0 and the difference that it makes and actually how good the bump is in Thea Render. It's almost like a good normal map already. I do recommend keeping this to about 50% because past 50% it kind of just gets darker. At 50% it looks more real to me most of the time. The last thing here is the alpha map. It looks like the alpha map is not right here in the preview, but in this top preview you can see it is right. That's because if we open this up in the Thea Material Lab by double clicking on it, we can see the clipping is using this texture. Right click on it. Now we can see in the texture preview that the channel it's using is alpha, and that is the correct channel. This is actually where we pick which channel we want to use if it has multiple channels. So we can use RGB, or in this case we want to use the alpha map. Within this texture channel, we can also right click on texture on any of these that say texture, then click on whichever layer we want here and click on tone. So this gives us a lot of functionality that some of the tone mappers that we have within Cinema 4D gives us, but it's better to use them here because they will work quicker with Thea Render. Since I didn't really make any changes to this, I can just click reject to not accept them, or accept to accept the changes, or the X here. So I'm just going to click reject because it was fine before. The other thing I'll show with this scene is that this scene is actually using a physical sky. This physical sky. So to get this physical sky over to Thea Render, or any physical sky, the easy way to do this would be to copy it, make a new scene, paste it into the new scene. Now make a sphere, put a 100% reflective material on the sphere. Now put a Cinema 4D big texture tag, and we're going to want HDR radiance. Save it somewhere, give it a width, double the width of whatever the height is, and we're going to bake out the reflection. This is going to bake out the whole scene into a nice HDR image. Which we can then use in Thea Render over here in the image-based lighting. And that's how we can get any physical sky used here within Cinema 4D to be ported over to Thea Render. The other thing with this scene is it has a copper material, but then it has this copper material on a layer above the other copper material on the pipes. Within Thea Render, we can have all the layers on a single material. Easy way to show this is by double-clicking on a material. Let's go to metals, and I can say copper, or maybe copper deco is more appropriate in this situation. Within here I can put another basic material, up the layer on that. On this top layer, under layer, let's right click on texture and add a procedural noise to it. That'll make it so that I can have some parts of this show the copper through it, and other parts show the basic layer on top. In this case, black is what shows through and white is what's on top. So I'm just gonna lower the white value a little bit to get the copper to show through a little bit more. I can also adjust these values. And now I can create the diffuse layer on top to look more like rust. And that's how we can get a ton of different layers within Thea Render. We don't have to use this multiple material stacking method over here. If we're doing the stacked materials within Cinema 4D, the substrate material is the bottom one, and stack 1 is the highest one. These other ones are in between. The video is pretty long, so I'll cut it off here. I hope that helps you converting Cinema 4D scenes over to Thea Render, or if you're just learning Thea Render from using Cinema 4D a lot, I hope that helps you to get started using it better and quicker. Happy rendering!